Today on the 21st of May, a new super tournament just started in Warsaw. It's the second leg of the Grand Chess Tour. It's a rapid and blitz event taking 5 days in total, 3 days of rapid, 2 days of blitz, and 10 of the world's best players are participating, including former world champion Magnus Carlsen. He is back at the board, and that is great news for all the chess fans. In the first round of this event, he is playing against Polish number 2 Radoslaw Wojtaszek, who is a very strong grandmaster. Not the same level as Magnus, obviously, but a very strong grandmaster who has been a long-term second of former world champion Vishy Anand. And he's a great player himself. He managed to defeat Magnus Carlsen once in Wijk aan Zee in a very convincing style. And let's see what's happening today in this game. Wojtaszek playing with the white pieces, Magnus with black. And the big question, of course, is Magnus still really motivated? Now, he has given up his world title. What are his ambitions in chess still? Does he have any serious goals? He once mentioned that he wanted still to get 2900, but okay, that's very unlikely to happen at some point. Where does his motivation come from in this game? He's playing with black. Wojtaszek opens here the game with the move 1, d4. And looking at the first move of Magnus, he is surprising all of us here with the move b5. What is that move, you may wonder, because it's a very weird move. Well, the idea is in fact to develop the bishop to the long diagonal, but you're not fighting for the control in the center. So this is definitely not the most popular move against 1d4. I'm not even sure it's among the top 10 popular moves for black against 1d4. But is it that bad? Well, it's definitely played with the idea to get Wojtaszek out of book, because Wojtaszek is a really strong theoretician, very well prepared. And I think it's also a sign of Magnus that he is bored of playing all these heavily studied openings. He wants just to play a game and try to surprise the opponent as early as possible. And the interesting fact here is that this is called the Polish opening. So he's playing the Polish defense on Polish soil against Polish number 2. Let's see how that goes. White goes for the principled move e4. So he's occupying the center with both its pawns, attacking the pawn on b5 at the same time. And rather than protecting the pawn with a move like a6, black goes for the counterattack, bishop to b7, hitting the pawn on e4. And black is willing to trade off that flank pawn for the central pawn. I mean, white still has reasonable chances to fight for an advantage over there. But Wojtaszek says, well, I prefer to keep my center intact. Goes for the move bishop d3, and Magnus goes for the move knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4 one more time. And here Wojtaszek plays the move knight to d2. Interesting move. He could also have placed his knight on c3 so that the bishop can be developed still. But if you put a knight on c3, black's idea is of course to go b4. So knight is on d2 and black decides to play here the move c5, trying to challenge and destroy white's center. And now of course the pawn could be taken, but obviously Magnus had some ideas in mind, for instance with e6 to regain the pawn. So white is not interested in grabbing the pawn, but plays the move c3, strengthening the center. And after c takes d4, I think white can be very satisfied with the opening so far. The center is well protected. Black goes e6. And now white goes knight gf3. And black goes knight c6. So interesting moment, because by developing the knight to c6, black is no longer attacking the pawn on e4. So white could just have taken the pawn here on b5. But I'm pretty sure this was a conscious decision by Magnus, and he was probably just intending to follow up here with the move queen b6, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn on d4. Obviously white can try to stick to the pawn by giving up the bishop for the knight, but black has quite a bit of active piece play, and perhaps there is some long-term pressure on the queen side as well. I think this may still have been some part of black's home prep. In any case, Wojtaszek was not interested, just castled here, and that's very sensible move, of course. And still, black may have continued here with a simple developing move, bishop e7, with the idea to castle. But instead, Magnus tries to defend the pawn on a6. But to me, such moves also, they feel a bit slow. You've given up the center, and you got to make sure that all your pieces are going to join play rather than making a lot of pawn moves. And on top of that, you want your king to be in the safe spot. White goes for the move rook e1. Useful move, overprotecting the pawn on e4. And after bishop e7, we actually get to see another idea behind White's last move. Because here, White plays the move d5, attacking the knight on c6. And all of a sudden, there are a lot of tactical ideas popping up in this position. For instance, if the knight would go away, maybe d6, attacking the bishop. And if you do take, e5 is one threat hitting both the bishop and the knight on f6. But sooner or later, the pawn on d5 should be taken. So therefore, Magnus decided just to take the pawn. And now, Wojtaszek doesn't recapture, which is a very understandable move, but black can just take it back. Instead, the main point behind White's pawn push d4, d5 is to advance the e-pawn now. And as you can see, that knight on f6 is under threat, and the knight can no longer come into d5. So the knight got to move away, but the question is, where does it go? If you go forward to e4, you're giving the pawn back. In this such position, White has a very clear advantage. Free piece play, a backward pawn on d7. It's a dream position for White against the former world champion. But Magnus didn't play it, of course. He decided, after the move e5, to play knight to h5. This looks a bit weird, but the knight is intending to come back into the game, attacking the bishop on d3. But here first we go for the move knight to b3. The knight is doing well, on its way to d4 perhaps, or maybe another square. And more importantly, the bishop prevents the knight from coming back into play. And if black is careless, let's say he castles, there would follow the move g4, and all of a sudden the knight is trapped at the side. So before castling, you got to do something about that knight, but there are not that many available moves. Black played here the move g6 to protect the knight, and hopefully the knight may come back into play via g7 to e6 at some point. But bishop h6 is played, and that's a very good move, not allowing the black king to castle. So what should black do? Now his king is not allowed to castle, and Magnus came up with a very radical solution, a move I absolutely disliked. He played here the move rook g8, probably with ideas to get the knight back to g7 at some point. Maybe there are ideas sometimes based on g5 to trap that bishop on h6. In any case, black is no longer allowed to castle. Bishop e3 played. I should, by the way, mention that instead of rook g8, maybe bishop f8 would have been a better move. But then after the exchange of dark squared bishops, the main problem is that the knight can come into c5, and white has a definite advantage. Maybe rook c1, queen d2, easy piece play for white for sure. So let's get back to the game. Rook g8, and now the bishop itself is not doing that much, so Wojtaszek thought, let's bring the bishop back to e3 to guard the c5 square, preparing the knight to come in. Black played knight g7, and now knight c5, hitting the bishop on b7. And of course you can think, well, let's just get rid of that knight with bishop takes c5. But then bishop takes c5, and this bishop can just install itself on d6. And look at that king, it's totally stuck. You have such weak pawns, weakened dark squares. This looks absolutely awful. All the pawns on light squares, this bishop on b7 can barely move. This is positionally just totally busted. So black instead thought, let's keep this bishop on the board. He played queen c7 to protect the bishop. But then the rook comes into c1, opposing the queen on the open file. That's a good strategy. And now knight e6. Trying to initiate the exchange of some minor pieces at some point. And now there are various ways of playing. You can keep the knight on c5. You can move it away. I thought bishop f1 is a nice move just to slide the bishop backwards, opening up the d file for the queen. Wojtaszek played knight takes b7, queen takes b7, and only now bishop f1, hitting the pawn on d5. And of course black doesn't want to give up that pawn that easily. Played bishop b4, attacking the rook, and after the rook goes away to e2, Magnus's idea was here to play the move knight e7 to overprotect the pawn on d5 with both the queen and knight. It's a very passive move, but it also has some idea to get a knight around to f5 at some point. But first things first, the rook comes over to c2. Of course, nice way of doubling the rooks. The bishop is active again. And white is of course looking for ways trying to penetrate with its rooks into black's position. But for the moment, black has all these entry squares under control. Knight f5 played, trying to get rid of this bishop. But look, the bishop comes into g5 with the idea to come to f6. And then you have long-term problems regarding your king's safety. If you do take on g5 the bishop, there's knight takes g5 and there are a lot of problems. h7 is hanging, but also that knight on e6 is no longer there, and all of a sudden white is about to enter with the rook on c7. So therefore black decided, I need to keep that knight on the board, and Magnus played here the move bishop to e7. And now interesting idea is, rather than exchanging the bishops off, Wojtaszek played bishop f6, and I really like this move. I think it's a subtle idea, because the big difference is that if black does decide now to trade off bishops, you get a pawn on f6, and that makes life even more difficult for the black king. The king cannot go anywhere, and the rooks are also out of play still. So what should black do? That's a good question. There are not that many useful moves at all. Knight fg7 was played, hoping to maintain the grip on that knight on e6. But here, big moment. Wojtaszek played queen d3, but in hindsight, and don't forget it's a rapid game, so that explains the number of mistakes by both players. But the key idea here for white is to get rid of black's most annoying defender. He could have gone here for knight g5, which is a piece sacrifice. But it's an incredible idea, which I definitely want to show you. The idea is very simple. We would love to take. So for instance, if black ignores everything, plays h6, you're gonna take, knight takes e6, and then you play g3, followed by bishop h3. On the next move you take on e6, and after that the rook is about to enter with devastating effect. That is the plan. But why is this move so difficult to find? Well, very simple. Black can just capture the piece. Knight takes g5 is a possibility. But then there's also rook to c7, hitting the queen. The queen gotta go away, and now it's rook to c8 check. Rooks are coming off the board. You can only block the check with your bishop. But now after taking on d8, black is forced to give up the queen, and white's queen enters black's position. It's game over. Just one more line, because look, there was also this line, bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, e takes f6. And now the knight on g5 is still hanging. You can decide to take on g7, but the most beautiful move here, in fact, is queen takes d5. Nice deflection motive, queen sacrifice. If you do take, it's rook c8, and it's back rank mate, thanks to that very important pawn on f6. Missed opportunity, but very difficult to find. And still, queen d3, it's quite a sensible move, I believe. But what should black have done? Well, probably something like knight h5 to put pressure on that bishop on f6. And after bishop takes e7, king takes e7, white is better, but there's still a lot to play for. But Magnus was a bit impatient, decided to take on f6, but this pawn, this is going to be a huge problem for black. There followed knight h5, so you're attacking the pawn on f6, but now queen to c3 is an interesting move. You're protecting the pawn on f6, and of course there are sometimes idea to enter on the c file as well. What should black do? Well, Magnus played here rook d8, which is probably not the best move. Maybe d4 is an idea to interfere on the c3 f6 diagonal. There's knight takes d4, and well, the pawn on f6 can still not be taken because of this discovered capture. You're winning the knight. So there are still a lot of problems. Apparently, maybe black would decide to go for the move b4, and after queen goes away to e3, then you can take the pawn on f6. But after queen e5, there are so many problems. The knight is under pressure. The rook is about to enter on c7. White is just incredibly active for just only one pawn. Let's go to the game. Rook d8 was played by the ex-world champ. And now I think Wojtaszek played a little too soft. He played here the move a3. He wanted to stabilize its queen on that square. But I don't think the queen is doing that well. And there was a way to activate the queen here with the move queen e5. I think the queen is excellently placed on this square. Offering the exchange of queens doesn't work. There's rook c7 and the knight is pinned. You cannot take the rook. So here white is just dominating the center with his major pieces. Perhaps Wojtaszek considered the move, didn't like d6, and after queen e3 there is knight takes f6 again, but rook c7 once again. That's why the queen is so well placed on the e-file to prepare the entry of another major piece, and after the queen goes away, knight g5, black's position is falling apart. But in the game there followed a3, and that enabled black to get the queen to a better square. Queen b8, excellent move. White played g3 to cover the f4 square, and who knows, maybe the bishop comes to h3 at some point. But for some reason Magnus didn't play here the move queen d6. He is really rusty. This is such a natural move to centralize the queen, to cover a lot of dark squares. And who knows, you can move your king to f8, try to hold your position, and white has difficulties to make progress because the queen still got to retain control over that pawn, as otherwise black is just going to capture it, and later on the king can even come to g7 and just play out this position. It's a fight. But instead Magnus played too ambitiously, played here the move g5. What is that? Well, he want to go rook g6 or maybe g4 to attack the knight, maybe wrap up the pawn on f6. Well, there followed rook to e1. And then he played here the move g4, knight to d4. And now all of a sudden you get to see that the pawn on g6 is no longer there, which means that the f5 square is seriously weakened. Still, the pawn on f6 cannot be taken by black. There is knight takes e6, and on the next move you capture on f6. So Magnus played here the move rook g5, not allowing the knight to come into f5. But there's bishop d3, very simple strategy. The bishop is no longer needed on h3, cannot go there of course. And instead we are trying to find new entries for our pieces. Knight f5 is on the agenda, so therefore rook e5 played. And looks as if black is about to consolidate its position, but things are far from simple. If white would just play something like rook e2, because what you need to understand, if black to play, let's say if you're just careless and you take a pawn, there's knight takes d4, and you cannot take the knight with your queen because the rook would be hanging. If you take first on e5, then the queen just recaptures and black is a piece up. But rook ce2 would be such a natural move, forcing the exchange of rooks, and then we are trying to find new ways for our queen to enter on b4 so that you can come to e7. Maybe knight f5 is an idea. White has a really powerful initiative here still. But instead, there followed the move knight f5. Also very tempting, and Magnus didn't come up with the right response. He decided to trade off rooks first, but he should have started here with the move d4. This is so important. If knight takes d4, once again, there is knight takes d4 and there's no time to take with your queen on d4, as the rook on e1 requires protection. But you could consider queen to b4, but that allows rook takes e1, queen takes e1, and knight takes f6. We get to see the same position in the game, but there is a big difference now, that white cannot really go for the move queen b4, threatening a devastating mate on e7. Thanks to this pawn on d4, Knight d5 is the key defense. You're attacking the queen as well as you're covering the mate on e7. Black is still fighting in that case. However, they followed rook takes e1, queen takes e1. And black is completely busted because there is no way to trade off more pieces. If you go rook c8, you can just exchange the rooks and the knight comes into d6, game over. Black's idea was to take on f6, obviously. But now there is queen to b4 and the big difference, there is no knight to d5. You're threatening checkmate, black got to come up with an alternative defense. But it's not so simple. If you go back with your knight to g8, first of all, this is a really sad move. But there is rook to e2 with a pin on the knight, which means the knight is not a good defender. Knight g7 is a mating threat. If you go somewhere like d6, you can even take the pawn on g4. Black has a massive initiative for just one pawn. This is just completely game over. In the game, there followed the move d6, blocking off the diagonal so the queen cannot come into e7. But now the queen comes to c3. Very important. This would not have been possible had the pawn already been on d4. d4 is still an option now, but after knight takes, queen takes, you're really missing that knight on e6, which was keeping the e-file closed. Now black's position is really falling apart. His knight is unprotected, the rook can come over, weak pawns, weak king, no coordination in black's camp. So that's not what you want, but it's already too late. If you go here for the move knight d7, which was played, there follows queen h8, the queen enters, knight df8, and now queen f6. Once again, it's a mating threat there. What to do? It's not that simple. If you go rook d7, I will go rook e2. Once again, the knight is pinned and knight g7 will be played on the next move. It's game over. I was looking at this move. Maybe queen b7 is an idea to protect the e7 square as well. But a4 would be a very nice way to create a second target. The simple plan here is to deflect the queen. If you take, for instance, bishop takes a6, you cannot take because of mate on e7. If the queen goes away, we have bishop to b5 and you're winning the queen and it will be mate very soon as well. So this move a4 is really strong as you're threatening to take twice on b5, deflecting the defender of the mating square e7. In the game, Magnus played knight g6 instead. It's another way of covering the mating threat, but after rook to e2, the knight is pinned again, and there's not much you can do. You cannot run away with your king. It's rook takes e6, and the f-pawn is pinned. You cannot allow that. If the king goes to d7, it's queen takes f7 and game over. Next move, you take the knight. Magnus's last move was queen c7, but now after knight g7, it's time to resign. The knight cannot capture because of the pin. If the king goes to f8, there's knight takes e6, and we're winning the house thanks to a nice family check. The final line is king to d7, but then once again it's queen takes f7, king c8, queen takes e6, and it's game over. So this was just a really bizarre game. We saw the former world champion, the greatest player of all time, just playing an absolute horrible game. He just completely misplayed the opening, violated the golden rules of fighting for the center. His king was stuck in the middle of the board for the entire game, and then you get such a final position. Very interesting game, very poor play by the current world rapid champion, but let's see what he is able to do in the coming days. If you like this video, just make sure you like it and you subscribe to the channel. I'll be back very soon again with more coverage of this Super Bad Rapid and Blitz tournament. See you then.